Hi, my name is Norm Snyder, and today my guest is Mike Anderson. He is a local stockbroker for A.G. Edwards. How are you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing fine, Norm. Thank you.
Okay, and now you're going to be telling us a little bit about hunting in Alaska.
I've taken 3 trips to Alaska hunting, and today what we'd like to do is talk about 2 of those trips that we've taken. We've got some slides and some video footage.
So, Mr. Anderson, why do you hunt? What's your purpose?
Well, Norm, I enjoy hunting, first of all. I enjoy being out in nature, and I grew up on a farm out in Imlay City. And my family hunted, my father got me into it, and I think that that's typical nowadays, that if your family hunts, then the youngsters carry on with that. Another reason that I hunt, and there's probably fewer hunters because we really don't need to hunt to put food on the table any longer. Hopefully we don't. But I hunt also because people are predators. And I think that, if you go back and look at the historical roots of history, you'll see that in one way, Norm, that you know that human beings are predators is because predators have their eyes on the front portion of their head. And herbivores have their eyes on the sides of their heads. Do you know why that is?
No, I don't.
Carnivores, which are predators, have to have depth perception to make a stalk. Herbivores, on the other hand, have to have wide-angled lenses so they can see the predators coming at them. It's a real simple test, and if you look at any mammals that you can think of, you'll find that that's true.
And what do you think about the anti-hunters then?
Well, I think that everyone's entitled to, their opinion. And for me, hunting is a way of life, something that I enjoy doing. And interestingly, 15% of the population hunts. 10% of the population is pretty much anti-hunting, which leaves a broad 75% spectrum there that knows something about hunting. Maybe their fathers hunted or their uncles, but they're kind of indifferent to it. They don't mind people hunting. On the other hand, it's not really for them. And I think that it's very important for hunters to understand those numbers, because all it takes is a few hunters to do the wrong things and not be good sportsmen. And those people, that 75%, if they're swayed to the standpoint that they think that hunting or guns are the wrong thing, then that's the thing that's going to affect legislation that's going to be negative for all sportsmen, all hunters. And keep in mind, that hunters, through their license fees, do a lot to protect the game and their environment and to sustain these different wetlands and that type of thing. They do more than any other group, by far. The other thing about the anti-hunting issue is that, left to nature's devices, a lot of animals are going to weed themselves out. And if you've noticed around the St. Clair County roads lately how many dead raccoons there are on the roads. One reason for that is because, fur prices are low because there's a lot of anti-sentiment against wearing furs and that type of thing. I guess what I'm saying there is that these animals, if they overpopulate and they meet the maximum limits to what the environment will hold them and contain them, then they're going to starve to death or have some other type of disease problem come in, and nature will take care of those numbers. It's interesting, there are more white-tailed deer today in Michigan than all of the United States when Columbus landed. And it's real interesting to understand that most animals adapt very well to man, that with most species, the vast majority, their numbers are much greater now because they live off of man, his farm crops, the way that we manipulate the environment, and most of them have done very well. Unfortunately, there's a relatively small percentage of animals that do not do well. And you can call that natural evolution if you'd like.
Okay, now, you hunt in Alaska, so what all kind of animals did you hunt in Alaska?
Well, I've hunted caribou, grizzly bear, interior grizzly bear, and moose in Alaska, and I've had licenses for other animals that I have not taken. Alaska is a phenomenal place, Norm, because it is really the last frontier. Alaska, up until the beginning of World War II, didn't even have a road to get to it from the continental 48 states. And it was for defense purposes that they built the Can-Am, you know, in around 1939, 1940 or so, that was actually completed. It is a phenomenally large state. You know, the area of Alaska would take up 1/3 of the 48 continental United States. And so when you talk about Alaska, it's really difficult because it's so huge. You'll see, you know, you can see the glaciers. There's Eskimo populations in the north part of it. There's Arctic Circle areas. There's real warm areas where the Pacific currents come up and meet the coast. So it's not like any other state that I know of as far as the diversity. In fact, if you even look at the native Indian populations in Alaska, there's 3 very distinct groups. And that happened because they were isolated and because of the size of the state. There's, of course, the Eskimos up along the northern portion. There's the interior Indians that were part of the migration down into the continental United States. And then there's also the Aleuts, or Aleutians, from the Aleutian chain. And unfortunately, you know, the Aleutians, there's not many true Aleutians left because of disease and because they were part of the Russian slave trade.
Now, what kind of animals do they have up there? What's the most common animals up there?
Well, the most common animals, it's a difficult thing to say. Alaska is known for certain species. When you go to the southern portion of Alaska, along the coast, that's where the largest animals in the world of certain species reside. That's where your largest moose in the world are, by far, often running twice the size of a typical Canadian moose. That's where your largest bear are, which can run, again, more than twice the size of an average Canadian or Montana bear. The fishing, of course, is phenomenal. The diversity is, there's nothing like it left that we know of. The caribou herd, and this is kind of interesting too, because when you see the National Geographic films, you'll see maybe a herd of 500 moving through an area. And I think that people can get the wrong idea about hunting, especially like hunting caribou, if they thought that that's how it really exists. And it doesn't exist that way. What they do to capture that film is there's certain times of the year when the caribou are migrating and when they're bunched up like that. And then to find those caribou, they have to fly. They find them by air, and then they'll land, and they'll take their photographs. But for a hunter, when you hunt, they're dispersed all over the landscape. In fact, there are fewer caribou. They say about 750,000 caribou in all of Alaska, and there's 3 major herds. There are fewer caribou than white-tailed deer in Michigan. So it gives you an idea that if you spread that many animals out over that size of state, you can look over a lot of land and not see an animal like that.
So you're saying the TV is making it look like they have more than what there really is?
No, I think that it's very impressive to see those huge herds move through. But I've hunted caribou 3 times now, each time that I was up there, and I have never seen a herd of that size. The most I ever saw together at one time were probably 15 animals. It's more typical to see 2 or 3, much like you'd see deer in Michigan.
Now, what about like the grizzly bears and the Kodiaks and the rest of the bears up in Alaska? Well, what's their population up there? Is it?
I can tell you that it's more dense there than any other place that I've ever heard of. There are 3 types of bear in North America. Do you know what they are?
No, I don't.
Do you want to take a guess at them?
I would say the black bear, grizzly bear, and the polar bear.
You're exactly right. And the Kodiak bear and the grizzly bear are the same species.
Isn't one a little smaller, though?
One's a little smaller. The interior grizzly bear is much smaller than the Kodiak, but genetically they're the same. The reason the Kodiak are twice the size is because they live on that southern coast, and there they live off of a lot of fish, and it's a relatively easy life for them, and they have a longer summer in which to put on weight. Whereas those interior grizzly bear, they have a real tough life to get through. They eat a lot of groundhogs and berries and things like that. So again, it speaks a little bit about the diversification of Alaska. Are you ready to take a trip?
Yeah, I'm getting ready.
Are you?
Yep.
What we want to do is, there's two trips that I'd like to highlight. My first one in 1989, and the last one that I just returned from in September of 95, this past year. And the first trip that we're going to take is into the Arctic Circle. And we're going to be just inside the Arctic Circle along the Canadian border. And this is very beautiful country, it's very rugged country, it's very remote. There are three major portions of this trip as far as the hunting. The first thing that we're going to hunt for is interior grizzly bear. Then we're going to hunt moose. And then we're going to take a stab at caribou, which is unsuccessful. This first slide, Norm, is at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And I'm standing beside a Kodiak bear. Kodiaks can range anywhere from 6 feet in length up to over 10 feet and go up to a weight of maybe 1,800 pounds. But I'm 6'1", 6'2", so you can see the height of that bear there. And we started out by flying into Fairbanks, and from Fairbanks we had a bush pilot fly us to a old oil landing strip. From there we were picked up by the guide himself, and he took us into the hunting camp. It's real interesting when you fly in on a trip like this, because you start with a 747 out of Metro in Detroit, and that'll take you to Seattle, then to into Anchorage, and then on to Fairbanks in this case. And then you get into a four-passenger Cessna, and from the four-passenger Cessna you get into a one-passenger Piper Cub. So the planes just keep getting smaller and smaller until you eventually reach your destination.
Okay, now on the Kodiak, are them horror stories really true about how they will attack you? And
Kodiaks will attack you, or a grizzly bear will attack you, but they are the least predacious of the three major bear species. Kodiak grizzly will attack you if you're interfering when it's feeding, or if they're younger nearby. Other than that, they're not known to attack man to actually stalk him, where that is not true with the polar bear, which is extremely predacious. And most people don't realize that black bear are more aggressive, more predacious than what a grizzly bear is. Black bears have been known to stalk people. Speaking of black bear, Norm, this is a black bear, even though it's not black. Black bears can come in many different shades. There are blonde black bears, this one here is what I would call a cinnamon color, and there are black bears. So they're just variations of the same species, depending on geographic regions and the genes in that particular population pool. From Fairbanks, this bush pilot took us into the oil company landing strip. It was probably a trip of about 200 miles. This young man crashed and was killed about a month after we were there. Being a bush pilot in Alaska is a very dangerous vocation. They don't buy life insurance at reasonable rates. I don't think they carry life insurance for that particular reason. Alaska was pioneered by these bush pilots, and what they have done up there as far as the transportation is phenomenal. Basically, if you want to get around Alaska, you fly. Even their capital city, Juneau, has no roads going in or out of it. They have roads around the perimeter of it for 30 miles in different directions, but there's no way to drive a car from Juneau down here to Michigan. This is my first camp when I arrived in Alaska, and this is the camp that we hunted grizzly bear out of, interior grizzlies. And after I was dropped off at the oil landing strip, I was picked up by my guide, Phil Shoemaker, and that's a one-passenger plane, Piper Cub, and we started flying into this valley that you can see here in the background. And the tent was down in the bottom of the valley. I could see that down there. I've flown a little bit myself, and I couldn't understand where he planned on putting this plane down. And he started to put it into a stall, which means he's getting ready to land. And I couldn't contemplate where he was going to put this down. And what he did was he saddled right up next to the side of the mountain, heading right into it. And on the top, there was a real smooth area that came down on an angle off the side of the mountain, kind of rolled off the edge of the mountain. And he put the plane into a stall right on the precipice of that ridge up there that you can see in the background, and stalled it so the plane actually landed against the side of the mountain and rolled to the peak. And I would think that he stopped that plane within 25 yards with no problem. And at that point in time, to take off, he would turn it around, hold the brake, give it lots of fuel, rev it up, release the brake, and you drop off the side of the mountain. The plane would drop down 50 yards and then start to pick up momentum and take off. It's a very hazardous vocation. This tent, when I got to Alaska on that particular evening, we did not have time to bring in anyone else, and he had to leave to bring in some hunters in some other areas. So my first night in Alaska, I spent alone in this tent. That tent did have a bear that came through it about 3-4 days before I got there. The animals out there are attracted to tin cans or any type of odors like that, and for the most part, they've never seen human beings. This is the guide that I've used on all 3 of my trips to Alaska. His name is Phil Shoemaker. Phil is a PhD and has a PhD in wildlife management, and so does his wife. I've got a picture of her and his family a little bit later. Phil's been guiding in Alaska for probably 12, 13 years now. At this particular time, he had severed a tendon when he was skinning out some game, and he did not bother to go and have it checked because he was busy, and he went in a month, 6 weeks later. Medical attention's not readily available. This is my interior grizzly bear that I killed, and I shot him on the 3rd day of the hunt. And he's a respectable interior grizz, but they do not get nearly as big as what the Kodiaks do on the coast. Notice the prominent hump in the middle of the back, which is indicative of a grizzly bear.
Now, what do you hunt with? What do you use to hunt your grizzly bears and your caribou? What kind of weapon do you use?
I use the same weapon there for all 3 of those animals, and that's a 7mm Magnum bolt action. This photo was taken from the point of the bear kill, and I wanted to show you what the terrain looked like, and this is up in the high country, and that prominent peak right in the center of the photo is where we spotted that bear from. When you hunt bear, you climb high, use binoculars, and then when you see the animal that you want to go after, you make basically a mad dash for it and hope that they're still there when you get there. But it gives you an idea of the distances involved. Got the interior grizzly. We went to the main camp, and rested for a day or so before we started to moose hunt. This is Phil Shoemaker again and his wife Rocky. They spend their lives, they live in the Alaskan bush. As I said, they're both PhDs and they raise 2 children out there. And they educate the children at home. There's the 2 children. That's Tina and Tosh. Very happy children. After we left the main camp, we hiked out and set up some spike camps to hunt moose from. This is along the Porcupine River area, along the Canadian border, inside of the Arctic Circle. And this is a typical camp that we might have. This is one of the gentlemen I went with on the first hunt. This is Dean Deshawn from Smiths Creek, Michigan. And it's amazing. He's cooking that night, but when you hunt up there and you hunt hard all day, everything tastes good. This is one of the guides, and it's not atypical that you would not hunt the rivers for the moose. For the most part, the moose are going to be in some of these lower areas, and it's a lot easier to travel the rivers in Alaska than it is to hike overland. This is Dean with his moose kill. He had killed this just before I got back to main camp, in fact. I was bear hunting when he took this animal. That is a large interior moose. It probably weighs up around 1,800 pounds or so. As you can see, he shot that with a .44 Magnum pistol. And to attract that moose, they could actually smell the moose because it was during rut. And understand that these animals have never been exposed to people. So Dean is a good hunter. He went onto shore, made a lot of racket, the opposite of what you do with deer hunting, breaking down brush, and that moose came to look for him and actually did charge. And when they're rutting like that, they're quite dangerous. The native Alaskans are more afraid of moose than any other animal. Here's the moose. It's quartered, and each of those quarters might weigh 200 pounds. There are no horses here where we're at, so hopefully if you shoot a moose, you want to shoot it near the river so you have some transportation. But even then you have to pack it out on your back to the river, and I can tell you that it's a lot of work. This is a guide caping out a moose. They get it ready for the taxidermist and salt it down. This is myself with my moose kill. That's a nice moose. It's got real good palmation on that. Towards the front portion of the horns there, that's the palms of the moose, and that's a very nice rack from that standpoint. I shot that moose at probably 300 yards or so. Interestingly, I was hunting by myself that day. The guide was unavailable. He had to do something else, and it was probably one of the most exciting hunts that I've ever made. I want to show you where I spotted this moose from. This is the area that I was using the spotting scope from and the binoculars, and way off in the upper right-hand portion of that picture is a green swampy area, and that's where I could see the moose at from this vantage point. To get to that moose, I had to cross that Porcupine River there and work my way over to him. I might mention too that Porcupine River area is it's a very beautiful area. If you're interested in learning more about it, there is a new book out now, Journey. It's one of James Michener's books, and it talks specifically about this area through here. In fact, James Michener was authored Alaska also, and if you want to learn more about Alaska, that's an excellent book to read. To cross that river, it's not as easy as what you might think without a boat. It's a fairly fast river in this particular area. There's portions that are shallow, there's other portions that are deep. And to cross a river like that when you're on foot with a backpack, typically you're going to cut a large limb and use it as a third leg. And whenever you cross a river like that, you crossed right above the rapids on a V formation. You cross into the current, then down with the current. The river is always shallowest right above the rapids. When I was coming back from the Moose Kill back to the main camp, I came across the remnants of a log cabin. And there was just the first few logs along the base, along the ground, and it was badly, badly deteriorated. And I asked the guide about it, and he told me that it was an old trapping cabin. And at one time, this area was populated, this particular area, by a family. And the family was a mother and 3 daughters. And it was during the Depression era and before, and they made their living trapping out here, and they might have had 30 of these different cabins, little 10 by 6s, that they would trap for a day and then spend the night in. I thought that was amazing. He gave me a book to read, and it was basically a diary of one of the girls. And they talked about the encounters they had with the moose, the temperatures. They were here throughout the winter, and this is inside the Arctic Circle. And they dealt with temperatures of 50 below zero, wind chills of close to 100 below zero, and while they were eking out a living. And then once a year, they would go into the Yukon, and they'd float down the river, and they would sell their furs during the summer, buy their supplies, and come back and do the same thing over again throughout the winter. When they first went into this area, they were quite young, and the father passed away, and the girls were just preteen and teenager. But really, a phenomenal story of the heart and survival. Eventually, when they went into the Yukon, a couple of them found boyfriends and decided not to come back. That's the last time there's been any people in this area. This is the beginning of the caribou hunt. Bill Shoemaker had seen some caribou by plane a couple of weeks earlier in the mountains. So we backpacked up into the mountains. And he told us what we were looking for was a tent that they had dropped from a plane that was in a tree that he had dropped 2 years before, and it had canned goods in it. And that's what we were going to live off of. So he gave us an idea where this tent was at, and we marched into that area, and we got there too late to actually pitch the tent. So we used it as covers for the night. Interestingly, when we were hiking up, we saw no wildlife, and it was kind of surprising because the guide was telling us that just a week before they had seen 5, 6, 7 black bear on the way up, and they had seen moose, and they had seen some caribou, and we saw absolutely no sign of wildlife hiking on up there. I wish I'd paid more attention to that fact. This is the tent the next day. We got it pitched. It had a few holes in it, but something is better than nothing, as they say. Again, we hunted that day and we saw nothing, and not caribou. We did not see any signs of life. Animals have an amazing ability to sense a storm, and they tend to disappear when there's low pressure. Now this night, it started to snow, and I don't have any pictures of the storm itself because I was kind of busy just staying warm and staying dry and staying alive. But it snowed, and I'm thinking that I've got a plane to catch out of Anchorage in a few days to get back to work. Next morning it let up for a little bit, and I made a major mistake, judgment mistake, and I started to head back when it had cleared. But it was just a temporary clearing, and we got into some very rough weather here, and we were without food because in Alaska you leave the food with the tent then for the next group that comes along. And the winds along those peaks there that we were walking on were 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, It was a complete whiteout. We could not see a thing. Interesting thing, too, in Alaska, it's very rare for them to ever take a compass reading. The reason they never take a compass reading is because they travel from mountain peak to mountain peak, and they're quite visible. So if you want to go somewhere, it's just line of sight. And they just don't travel when the weather's bad. So they just hole up, and much like the animals do. And of course, it's our modern time constraints that can get us into these types of problems. We went down into the low country trying to get down so we can get some wood, and this is the morning of the second day of the storm, and it had let up by this point in time, and that's the guide, quote unquote, that was there at that time. His name is Frank, and we found our way back that particular day, but we had no shelter. Those are our ponchos that we had strung together to make some form of tent out of, and we did not have food for a few days there. And we were lost. We did not know where we were at that particular point in time. There was some question as to whether or not we were going to get out of this, and Frank and I were cutting cards for $1 million a cut, figuring that no one would ever have to pay off on it. On the way out of Alaska, stopped at a town called Circle, and I thought this is kind of interesting. This is along the side of the road. This is an Indian cemetery. Another shot of one of the graves. Then I went to the resort of Circle Hot Springs, and this is a cache, a food cache at Circle Hot Springs to keep the animals away from it. It's kind of strange that they have a resort right up in the center of the interior of Alaska, but it is called Circle Hot Springs if you look at a map, and they do have hot springs there. They have almost an Olympic-sized swimming pool that you can utilize. The area that the guide had exclusive rights to were 30 miles wide by 60 miles long, and in that area there was 3 hunters, and he had exclusive rights to guide people within that particular territory. And you don't see any other hunters. There's no one there. He had to go in there when he built his cabin and build the airstrip that he landed on. Otherwise, there was no other place to land a plane. So it was very remote. The closest town was a small Indian village of around 10 people. It was 250 miles away, and that had no roads to it.
So you were pretty much out there by yourself?
Definitely by yourself.
There's no other life out there besides the wildlife?
Just the wildlife, and you know, if you've ever hunted partridge in Michigan, I thought this was quite phenomenal. One night for dinner, I went out with a .22 pistol to shoot some partridge, and the partridge would sit there just 10 feet away from you, and you could, if you missed, and I'm not very good with a pistol, if you missed, you could take 2 or 3 shots because they weren't frightened at all. I've had red fox up there come up and take sandwiches right out of my hand. They're not afraid of people as you would think that they might be. They're wary, but they're not frightened.
What's the reason that they're not afraid of people? I mean,
well, they've never been exposed to people, and in turn, you know, when they were coming out of the nest or out of the litter or whatever, their own parents never taught them to be afraid of man. It's never been an issue.
There's no reason to be afraid of them then, to them.
That's correct. That's why the moose will charge up there. They're wary. A lot of species are wary, but they're not really afraid of you. They just don't know what you are.
Okay, well, now let's talk about a little bit of your second hunt in southern Alaska.
The second hunt that I'm going to show tonight was in 1995 in September. It was down on the Katmai Peninsula. This is known as being probably the premier hunting area in the world for moose and Kodiak bear. And we did see some Kodiak bear, and we did see some moose, and we are hunting caribou on this particular trip. And I'll show you some pictures and slides of some other Kodiak that were killed, but not on this particular trip. The Katmai Peninsula is directly across from Kodiak Island. It's right at the top of the Aleutian Island chain. We're hunting right there in the National Refuge, and it's very isolated in this particular area. The guide, Phil Shoemaker again, has a main camp that's just about in the middle of that refuge, and he was able to do this because before 1960, you were able to homestead, anyone could homestead anywhere they wanted to in Alaska. And he decided, or the predecessor to him, decided to homestead right in the middle of the National Refuge. Even though the name is National Refuge, hunting is allowed there. The problem is accessibility. The national park that you see to above that and to the right, you cannot hunt in. There's a Kodiak. This is in a museum. On the way in, it's at King Salmon. Fly into King Salmon. From King Salmon, we fly into the main camp, and from there, we take a Piper Cub into the mountains. This young fellow is Paul Moody. He's from Birmingham, Michigan. He's formerly a Port Huron native. Paul's 6'4", gives you an idea of the size of that bear. This is Paul and a couple of the other fellows that were on the hunt, and they had just gotten into main camp on a Cessna. This is Phil's winter home down in the south on the peninsula, and basically that's a pretty rudimentary type of lodging as far as our standards here in Michigan go. The materials to build that building right there are probably $100,000. Everything has to be flown in. There's no wood here on the peninsula. If you look in the background, you'll see it's quite barren. A lot of grass, a lot of marsh, a lot of rock, and brush, a lot of brush about the height of a man's head, but no trees. This is inside Phil's home. This is in the kitchen. That's Bert Herring from Port Huron, Michigan. He's putting on a few calories before he goes out to hunt. Right outside Phil's cabin door is an active volcano. It's a very volcanic area. These are some shots of the terrain that's typical up there. Again, very barren. In the background there, you can see the brush in the low areas. The animals can hide in the brush with no problem. There's a lot of streams through that brush. A lot of water. It's relatively new land because of the volcanic activity. This is our spike camp, and this is the cook tent, and this is where we spent a week in September hunting and fishing out of.
You know how many people was with you there?
In this spike camp, there was 4 hunters. There was a guide, Frank, the one that got me into trouble on the last trip back up in the Arctic Circle. And then we had a young fellow to help us pack meat. He's about 18 years old. This is what it looks like from the front of the camp. Gives you an idea of the type of terrain, again, that we're hunting. This is Bert Herring from Port Huron with his caribou kill. That's a nice specimen. We kind of teased him because the antlers are not typical of what we normally see. We told him that those antlers look like the Grinch that stole Christmas. This is Pat Houle from St. Clair, Michigan, and he took a very nice caribou, and he took that when I was with him. And that's myself with my caribou. Those 2 caribou bulls were fighting. We saw them in the distance. It was probably in the 5th day of the hunt before we were able to get a shot. And we probably saw a total of 100 caribou up to that point in time. This is back at our spike camp again. And you can see us drying our clothes there in the background. The peninsula is known for wind and rain. It's known for constant bad weather. In fact, a lot of the pictures, a lot of times, the video camera would not work. It was just shut down because of the humidity. The fishing up there is phenomenal. Here's Paul Moody with a salmon. It was getting a little bit late for salmon. A lot of the bear that had migrated down to take advantage of the salmon run were already heading back north on their own migration. And there's a rainbow trout, nice specimen. And these fish were just phenomenal. Honestly, every other cast you'd bring in a fish. They would take spoons, spinners, flies, anything that you dropped into the water. Do you know what that is, Norm?
No, I
What
don't.
type of fish? That's a grayling. It used to be native to Michigan in the Grayling River. Most of what we were catching were dolly Barton. There we're heading out of the main camp, and out of 8 of us, we took 7 nice specimen.
Now, I see that you didn't hunt bear. Do you have any information on the bear or any photos on the bear up in that area?
Right, we didn't hunt bear that last trip here in '95, and I do have some photos of Dean Deshawn from Smith's Creek of his bear, or one of his bear, and this is a beautiful specimen that he's got. It's over 10 foot in length, and at the time it was killed, it was definitely in the top 5 ever taken there, and that was right there on the Katmai, hunting out of the same camp that we were hunting caribou out of. That is the place to get the world record Kodiak. The moose rack spreads in this particular area can go over 70 inch, and I wouldn't say that they're common, but they see them every year, over 70 inch. This is a photo of a Kodiak den that they utilize in the wintertime. It's kind of interesting.
Will they go back to that same den year after year? Or?
That's my understanding.
Yeah, so
That's
like,
what they do.
like when the mother dies, will the cubs continue going back there, or do they find their own?
I think that another bear stumbles onto it as of that
okay.
point, and there's a new
So
owner.
they're always usually filled then, there's no vacancy?
No vacancies.
Okay, now Mr. Anderson, can you tell us when you're planning your next trip to Alaska, or if you are planning it?
I'm not planning another trip as of this point. You know, I'll tell you, I'm finding that I am getting older and I'm not able to do as much as I used to do when I went up to Alaska. And it is a lot of work because everything's on foot. There are no horses. You cannot use anything mechanized. You cannot fly and hunt the same day. So everything is done on foot. And I think next time I go up, and I definitely want to go again, but I think I'll take the cruise out of Vancouver.
Okay, well, we'd like to thank you for coming, and maybe see you in some future hunts.
Thanks
a
a
lot.
lot.